Initially pitched as a 1930s pulp version of Spider-Man, Marvel Noir was a 2009 comic series that took place in an alternative continuity. These tales were inspired by themes typically seen in film noir and pulp fiction, and they were set in an alternate reality of Earth 90214. Often, these noir comics replaced the hero's superpowers with noir-flavored characterization, and today, we will especially glance at the X-Men Noir comics. Introduced as a 4-part series in 2008, these series were created by Fred Van Lente and Dennis Calero. And today, we shall explore this 4-part comic series and tell you all about it. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. X-Men Noir, Captain Logan's World. The X-Men Noir comics kick off on a strong note with a bunch of detectives as they investigate the murder of a woman in her early 20s, who is soon identified as Jean Grey. While her body washes up near Welfare Island in the East River, they have a better look at it and see that there are slash marks and bunches of free all over her body. They don't seem too shocked by the crime and look further, only to realize that her nose, eyes, and upper lip are missing. They realize that this looks familiar, and their head officer constantly reminds them to write up their report while they conclude that this is the work of the X-Men. He comments on how this crime will join the endless list of their evil deeds over the years, and one of the officers then asks Fred about the history of the X-Men. He then tells them that the X-Men in this reality are actually a bunch of sociopathic teenagers who are all recruited by an infamous psychiatrist named Charles Xavier. Xavier ran his school for gifted youngsters in Westchester in 1937, and he eventually lost his psychiatrist license after he started training these delinquents to sharpen their criminal talents instead of reforming them. Xavier expressed his belief in the fact that sociopathy was the next step in human behavioral evolution, and he was eventually arrested and taken to Rikers Island where he awaited charges. As the story returns to the detectives, we learn that Jean Grey would often run scams and that she had also gained a reputation for controlling other people's minds. While the NYPD Homicide Department's chief, Eric Magnus, investigates the scene, the detectives conclude that Jean Grey might have been killed off by one of her X-Men team members. Moreover, we learn that Eric Magnus was also a big believer in eugenics, a plotline that often takes the backseat in mainstream Marvel content, but is explored in depth in these noir comics. Eugenics refers to the practice of improving the genetic quality of the populace, and Eric took a great interest in this field. While leading the homicide department, Eric also ran the Brotherhood Society in secret, which was responsible for most organized crimes in New York City. Eric's son, Peter, also worked in the homicide department, along with a partner named Fred Dukes, while his daughter, Wanda, was a socialite who was involved with many people at once. On the one hand, she was dating a famous reporter named Tommy Holloway, who was also a costume vigilante named Angel in secret. But on the other hand, she was going out with a casino owner named Remy LeBeau, and an Irish heroin dealer named Sean Cassidy. As we go back to the story, the night begins at the Creole Club, where Tommy and Remy cross paths with one another and talk about the X-Men. As the night progresses, Tommy eventually crosses paths with Eric's daughter, Wanda, which kickstarts their love story as they share a drink. Tommy seems to have a lot on his plate, and the next comic panels show him at Rikers Island as he pays Charles Xavier a visit. They discuss the works of Bolivar Trask and his sci-fi story, The Sentinels, while Xavier also talks about his findings about sociopathy. Tommy eventually tells Xavier about Jean Grey's murder, while Xavier tells him how he was the only one who ever tried to understand the X-Men and help them open up. While the visiting hours end, Tommy takes his leave and expresses his views on how he cannot sit by and watch the police treat Jean Grey's murder like it's no big deal. As he takes his leave, Charles Xavier returns his sci-fi magazine and Tommy leaves the prison. He looks at it, and he found out that the professor had written "Find Marie Rankin" on one of the magazine pages. On a different side of town, Eric holds a meeting of the Brotherhood and finally introduces his son, Peter, to the gang. As this comic winds up, Tommy somehow manages to track down the X-Men, and he tries to tell them that he's looking into Jean Grey's murder when they shut him down by pointing guns at him. The current X-Men team seems to consist of Scott Summers, Bobby Drake, and Hank McCoy, and they seem to be on the run after Xavier's arrest and Jean Grey's murder. In the second issue of the comic series, the X-Men wonder if they want to hear Tommy's theories about Jean Grey's disappearance. They soon decide against it and declare that they already know who was responsible for the killings. They blame Magnus for it, and reveal that he was the one responsible for killing Warren and then framing Professor X for it. Moreover, Eric Magnus has now managed to frame the X-Men for Jean Grey's death, and they soon realize that it might not be a bad idea to work with Tommy. At the same time, the crime rates in the city seem to be at an all-time high, and Eric faces pressure as the chief of detectives to, deal with it and bring the X-Men under control. So, while the Brotherhood seems busy with their criminal activities, Eric's children discuss their father's double-sided evil nature, and the story again shifts to Tommy and the X-Men. They visit his home in the old welfare pen and wonder why he's living in a place like this when he reveals that he grew up there. Tommy's father used to be the warden, but, he doesn't linger too long on this topic and soon questions the X-Men about their whereabouts on the night that Jean Grey was murdered. They reveal that they were at the Hellfire Club, and that Jean was also present with them that day, as she has managed to sweet-talk their doorman about the place's security layout. Eventually, Jean took her leave after her part of the job was done, and they didn't hear from her again after that, at all. Tommy then pulls out a case file titled Anne Marie Rankin, which seems to be a case that was referred by the chief of detectives, Magnus. They studied her life and all about how she got into trouble, but was always freed by a lawyer and her guardian named Raven Darkhold. Xavier also seemed to think that Anne Marie was in grave danger, and she had no friends or family to track her down. In the meantime, Eric Magnus also seems to be after Marie, and he pays Charles a visit to ask him if he can direct her to him. Charles doesn't seem too keen on helping him out, even when Magnus asks him if he wants another one of his former students to end up like Jean Grey. Eventually, the NYPD does track her down and tries to place her under arrest for, committing fraud, but Tommy gets to her first in his vigilante persona and urges her to come with him. She agrees to go with him and tells him all about how she got out of staying with the Worthingtons after Warren killed himself. She further confided in him about how she had to get away from the school, and she often confided in Jean as well, who would also share details about her life. She tells Tommy about how Jean was seeing a bootlegger in Chinatown while also dating Cyclops, and he eventually tells her that he must first get her to safety as both the X-Men and the Brotherhood are seeking her. This comic issue comes to an end with an introduction to Wolverine, whose sharp claws make him a direct suspect in Jean Grey's murder due to the slash marks on her body. We soon learn that Wolverine, or Captain Logan, is the bootlegger who was involved with Jean Grey, which only makes him a more prominent suspect in her murder. While Captain Logan operates out of Chinatown and keeps a low profile, he had established quite a web there, and he typically worked with his first mate, Eugene. As the scene shifts to the chief detective's family drama, Peter ends up shooting Remy in front of about 300 witnesses, and he then ends up in an intense conversation with Magnus where he accuses his father of keeping his life a secret from them. He complains about how he doesn't know anything about his father, and Magnus encourages him to let it all out. He then tells him that the only person who can help him get out of jail is Sebastian Shaw from the Hellfire Club. But of course, his help will come at a cost, and that cost is finding Unus the Untouchable. As the comic progresses, Tommy and Marie share a moment at his apartment, where she tells him she has grown to like his home, before eventually leaning in for a kiss. The comic ends on quite an intense note, as Peter tries to get his hands on Unus the Untouchable, but eventually fails and is arrested. In the final issue of the comic series, the X-Men manage to get Unus to safety, while Magnus is left stricken by the events that just transpired. He then asks his team to take him to the Hellfire Club, while Unus seems smug about having escaped. He even talks about how he needs to remind the Brotherhood why he is known as, the Untouchable. But his attitude doesn't get him too far, as he eventually dies in a face-off. As this series ends, Magnus faces Marie in person on the rooftop of the police station, but she kills him before escaping and finding herself face to face with Thomas, aka the Angel. After being involved with her momentarily, Thomas finally comes to the realization that Marie is actually Jean Grey in disguise, and that she killed the real Anne-Marie Rankin so that she could take her spot. Jean went on to these great lengths in order to avoid being captured by Magnus, and at the same time, she no longer wanted to be studied by Professor Xavier. While she was sure that Thomas could not kill her, the man who she assumed to be her newfound accomplice was actually Thomas's twin brother, Robert Halloway. Robert had no qualms about killing anyone, and Jean Grey's endeavors to free herself just, go down the drain there, as he grabs her and pushes them both off the roof. With this part of the comic coming to an end, the X-Men also consider their options, and Tommy briefly talks to Cyclops before finally getting on Captain Logan's boat and traveling to Madripoor with him. Marvelous verdict. The X-Men Noir comics truly managed to capture the audience's attention with their unique writing style, and Dennis Calero's excellent noir art style. But while it is a mini-series, it sheds light on several connections and characters that remain on the sidelines in the mainstream universe, and portrays the X-Men in quite an interesting light. And, the noir detective spin on classic X-Men lore especially makes it worth a read, and we hope you enjoyed exploring it with us. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, and be safe. Thanks everyone!